on leader and organizational effectiveness. Today's session is on breaking down boundaries, achieving results by improving collaboration. My name is Rick Lepsinger. I'll be your host and presenter for today's session. Everyone entered the meeting on mute, but you'll be able to ask questions, and we'll take questions at the end of the session. Just input them into the Q&A box, and we'll take a look at that at the end of today's session. So there are three key objectives for today. I'd like to cover these three. It's to understand why it's more difficult to work effectively across organizational boundaries, and to talk about the three prerequisites that are required. What are the foundational elements that are needed to ensure collaboration among the members of a cross-functional team? And then we'll also focus on the skill side and talk about the most critical skill to enable a leader to function effectively in a multifunctional, cross-functional team. The information for today's session and many of our webinars come from two key sources. The first is our book on closing the execution gap, where we took a look at 408 companies and tried to understand why some are more effective at translating strategy into action and consistently achieving business results. One of the key differentiators coming out of that study was the ability to work effectively across organizational boundaries. And when you are working across organizational boundaries, it's probably not unusual or unlikely that you're working in a geographically distributed team or in a virtual team. So we'll be also drawing on information from our book, Virtual Team Success, where we took a look at 48 teams across 16 industries and tried to understand why some virtual leaders are more effective than others. This matrix structure, or this multifunctional team structure, started to emerge around the 1960s, and really it became much more popular, much more highly used around that time frame, and it was driven by the increased complexity in work, and that would be illustrated by the aerospace industry and NASA's effort to put a man on the moon. And it was also driven by globalization, where we had the emergence of multinational global organizations, primarily in the chemical industry and the oil and gas industry. And what was needed was a more efficient organizational structure, one that could manage this increased complexity and be able to work on a multinational basis. And out of that came the familiar grid-like structure, which we've come to see as the matrix or the multifunctional team overall. This structure had actually many benefits, and it was very attractive, and it still is quite attractive. The key is to make it work. So in terms of the intended benefits, it allowed organizations to focus on multiple business goals. It encouraged organizations and people to specialize, to become expert at their area. It increased people's access to diverse resources and capabilities that they would not normally have available to them within their silo. It reduced duplication, where you, instead of having a finance person in every group, you were able to centralize it. Instead of having R&D in every business unit, you were able to centralize it. That produced more efficient coordination and use of resources, much more flexible staffing and resource allocation. It may seem surprising to some of you who work in this kind of a structure, but the intent is that actually the speed of decision making and the agility of the team increases dramatically. And we'll talk a little bit about what gets in the way of that, but also what you can do to make that happen and realize that benefit. And the increase in democratic and participatory decision making tended to increase individual and team motivation as well. This grid structure has actually evolved and morphed into what you're looking at here, which is more of a network structure. In particular, over the last 10 years, with the improvements in technology, the availability of more tools, that simple grid structure which many people at the time found challenging, has evolved into more of this network structure, where it has some of the same benefits, but a few additional challenges. In this particular network structure, there are fewer formal ties between the members of the matrix team or the cross-functional team. There's much more ambiguity regarding who your partners are. In that traditional grid structure, you tended to know who was on your team. In today's cross-functional team and matrix structure, many times you have to find out and discover who some of the key resources are. And what that does is it puts increased importance on maintaining, developing lateral relationships. And sometimes it's not even during the course, but in anticipation of being able to work together. So what are some of the challenges? What gets in the way of being able to realize these intended benefits? The first three here, I think, come up pretty frequently. The conflicting or unclear goals, when you have multiple functions that are being represented on a particular team, what is the actual goal? What are the key priorities? And unclear roles and responsibilities. Who's supposed to do what? How are we supposed to work together? And key to this is the ambiguous or shared decision authority. Who actually has the final say? Who's in charge here? Who makes the final decision? There tend to be internal conflicts, and there can be conflicting loyalties. Even though we're supposed to encourage cross-organizational focus and cooperation, we still tend to find people are silo-focused and have certain loyalty to their functional product or regional group. Now, some of this is driven by the way in which the performance management system is applied. And just quickly, if we still establish goals and performance metrics that are driven by the function or the product or the region, it's going to be very difficult to be able to focus your energy and attention on the matrix objective, especially if they are clearly at odds with each other. In addition, even though the matrix has been around for 55, 60 years, leaders still find it difficult to share decision-making. They're more comfortable in a hierarchical organization where clear lines of authority are laid out and everybody knows who the players are. The sharing of resources, although one of the benefits, can also be one of the inhibitors where there are limited resources to go around, and the lack of clear accountability for matrix performance. In other words, and that goes back to the driver of the performance management system, where what am I being rewarded for? And who's really accountable for this multifunctional, cross-functional group? Who's responsible for the outcome and the delivery? Now, one of the solutions can be adjusting and leveraging the performance management system. But in most cases, it's actually not clear who's really accountable. And of course, the increased complexity. You're no longer working up through a hierarchy. You have multiple players with multiple goals and multiple agendas working across a broad organizational structure, across a global palette as well. So it can become quite complex and difficult to keep track of. So this notion about the matrix, and many people really don't even like that word, but these cross-functional teams, some people would refer to that as the matrix. Every organizational structure has its problems. The challenge for leaders today is to take out the complexity, the uncertainty, the lack of clarity, and bring a little bit more structure and clarity to these cross-functional teams. And that's what we'll talk a little bit about today. So there are three prerequisites, let's call them, three foundational elements that help bring clarity to a multifunctional team, help take out some of the uncertainty, to have you feel more comfortable, again, with the same things that we like about a hierarchy, about knowing who the players are, knowing who's in charge. We can bring that same kind of clarity to a multifunctional team. And that's around aligning goals, looking for common ground, clarifying roles and decision authority, and ensuring transparency of communication. So let's take a look at the first, around ensuring alignment. This would start with the cascading of vision and company goals vertically, and that's fairly standard and traditional. The key here on these cross-functional teams is to set the goal for the cross-functional team first, and then have the function, the region, or the product group use that as their guideline. Once the function or region or product group sets their goal, it becomes much more difficult to find common ground among your matrix partners. And it's really the need to have a shared goal is the primary driver for cooperation. Without some kind of common goal, common value, shared direction, it's very difficult to get people to work with you. Even when they agree with what you're doing and feel strongly about what you're doing, people tend to get pulled back into their functional role, because that's where their reward and recognition tends to be. It's also necessary to review the goals horizontally to ensure that they are coordinated and mutually supportive, and it's good to do this work at the start of a cycle or at the beginning when a new team is put together. Identify the shared goals at the front end of the work. It's also, if you can't find a hard metric that you're working toward, then look for and make explicit what the shared value is, whether it's customer service or safety or improved quality, but what's the unifying theme? What is it that brings this group together that makes it desirable, that would make people want to work together? And that's what this whole shared goals, common ground is about. And you should make this a formal process. Again, at the beginning of each cycle, or when a team first is formed, there should be the formal requirement to make this happen. The second is around clarifying roles and decision authority. So given that network nature, it's not unlikely that not everybody knows everybody else, and finding some way to share job descriptions so at least everybody has a sense of where my job starts and where your job picks up in terms of where the handoffs are. But also, in a similar way with goals, it's helpful to work out roles and decision authority well in advance. If you wait until the moment when you need to sort of pull it all together, it can really delay the work process. But if you make it part of the team development as you're setting the goals, it's very helpful to clarify roles and how we're involved and decision authority. The key here is what you're doing is defining what cooperation and collaboration looks like and when we need to cooperate and collaborate. Frequently people use a tool like the RACI model. Some of you may be familiar with that, but there are many role clarification tools around. The key to any one of them is to apply the 80-20 rule rather than try to chart or discuss every possible activity or decision that this team may have to make, is to focus on the 3 or 5 most critical and work that out, and generally the rest sort of slipstream through, or the work you do to identify the 3 or 5 gives you sort of a model and a process, so if new things come up, you're more prepared to work those through sort of in the moment. The key here also is to involve critical stakeholders in a decision. It's probably not the best practice for the senior team to work out roles and just roll it down. You would like each team, each one of these matrix teams, to work out their own roles, because it's the conversation that's as important as anything that you may actually agree to. It's key to communicate it down to the next level so everybody knows what's been agreed to overall, and to use this as a living document, and you may have to revise some of the agreements based on your experience, based on sort of the real world, but keep it as a living document. The third is transparency of communication. This starts with making sure the right people are involved in decisions. And one of the frameworks to determine that would be thinking about decision quality and decision acceptance. So in this broad networked universe, how do I know who to pull into this discussion? If I think about who has information or experience that I may not have that can contribute to decision quality, and who do I need to support implementation or execution, those two criteria can help you come up with the short list of who should be involved, who needs to hear the message and be in the loop. You should also not assume that everyone is on the same page and be explicit in clarifying expectations. The skill of paraphrasing in terms of checking for understanding becomes critical, especially in multinational teams where you have different cultures and a range of languages that are being spoken. Formal communication plans that outlines who's supposed to communicate to who and when is also helpful, especially among people who do not work together on a regular basis, may be together just for this quick ad hoc team. Being formal about mapping that out can help facilitate the movement of information. And a highly underutilized tool, which is the action plan, and even if you did a low-tech version of it, like in a Excel spreadsheet or a Word document, the key benefit of the action plan is that it documents agreements and expectations. So everybody knows who's supposed to do what and when they're supposed to do it. So clearly it's helpful for managing the workflow and the project, but it also ensures transparency in terms of people's roles and their expected deliverables. So with these structural elements in place, you're set up for success, but even if you do a great job of having shared goals, clear roles, and decision authority, and the free flow of information and transparency of communication, you will still run into differences of opinion, different points of view. And what we found in all our studies is that among a range of skills, the most critical skill for being able to work effectively across organizational boundaries is the ability to effectively influence others, to gain support, to gain commitment over people over whom you have no direct authority. And what we mean by influencing is getting people to change their behavior, but not just their behavior, to change their opinion, their attitude, primarily to accept your point of view, but in a way that meets their needs as well, without coercion or without having them feeling like they're being directed. And there are a number of ways to make that happen. And over the last 25 years or so, we've been involved in a project that's been led by a gentleman named Dr. Gary Ugal out of the University of Albany, where we've identified 11 influence tactics. And the study tried to answer two questions. The first is, what do effective influencers do? And what you're looking at now is a range of 11 tactics. Some are more positive than others, but all of them are appropriate given the nature of the situation. And the second question we tried to answer is, among these tactics, which tend to be most effective for gaining commitment, which is a higher level of engagement. And you can see at the top the first four, which is reasoning, inspiring, consulting, and collaborating. And I'll just take a moment on those four. Reasoning is about using facts and logic. It's the most popular and frequently used influence tactic. The key to reasoning in terms of being effective, two criteria need to be in place. One is it's helpful to have shared goals. So when you're making a proposal supported by facts, it's directed to the thing that they're interested in. And the other is that you're seen as credible. And credible is made up of your track record, your education, your background, your experience, but it's also made up of the extent to which people believe you speak the truth. If they believe that you're giving an accurate and complete picture of the option, both its pros and its cons, or do they believe that you're selectively disclosing or putting a hyper spin on the positives? So that also helps explain why some of our best logical arguments don't always win the day. Inspiring is about focusing on values, and there's two components. One is being enthusiastic and engaging, and the other is helping people understand how your proposal is aligned with their values and their beliefs overall. This tactic tends to be used infrequently among the general population, but among high-performing managers and the more senior you get, the more frequently inspiring is used. Consulting is the participatory approach, involving people and helping you shape the outcome or shape the method. This works particularly well when people have information that you don't, or when you need people to support execution. But it's also most appropriate when you are willing and able to make changes. If you don't meet that criteria, consultation will not work very well for you. Collaborating, in this case, means looking for ways to reduce the difficulty, finding a way to supply resources or additional help that will make it easier for the person to comply with your request. More information on the rest of the influence tactics is in my book, Closing the Execution Gap, and on the website as well. In order to use influence effectively, a couple of key tips. One is that it's important to lay the foundation well in advance for the effective use of influence. Influence is not a single point event, and if you wait for the moment when you need to establish credibility, identify shared goals, to try to put those in place, it could really be a bit too late. In all your interactions, in every day and every way as you engage with people, you are laying the foundation to be able to influence people effectively. So you're demonstrating your credibility, you're getting to know their needs and values, you're building trust and positive relationships, so you have a wider foundation where you can use a range of tactics and not have to be overly reliant on rational persuasion. It's also important to know that you influence people from their point of view, not your own point of view. It doesn't matter if you think it's a compelling data point. It doesn't matter if you believe strongly in the value or if you see it as a benefit. It only matters what they see. The more you know about the other person, the better you can influence them. You can always use broad, general features, values, benefits, but the more specific you can make them to the person's particular situation, the more powerful your influence attempt would be. I mentioned about not being overly reliant on reasoning. It's the comfortable go-to tactic. We tend to use it on a regular basis, and it can be very effective as long as those two criteria, shared goals, perception of credibility, and truthfulness, are in place. When they're not, you need to work hard to put them in place and or move to other influence tactics. And by the way, the four that we talked about, reasoning, inspiring, consulting, and collaborating, make a very nice package. You seldom use one tactic at a time. You usually use them in bundles. If you are going to use reasoning, and we will, it's important to translate the facts, the features, the data that you provide into benefit statements. And again, the more I know about you, the more targeted and specific my benefit statement can be. So broad mom and apple pie kinds of benefits are fine. They work. But if I can really get down to something I know is important to you, that can be even much, much better. Influencing is also a conversation. It's not just a one-way, let me tell you my idea and why you should do it, and then you just agree. It should be a conversation, and the use of consultation and collaboration really require dialogue, but so does reasoning and inspiring. This means there needs to be an increase in the use of paraphrasing, restating your understanding, empathizing, which is demonstrating, restating your understanding of how they're feeling and demonstrating your understanding of their situation, and the use of questions. Questions to gather information, but also questions to stimulate problem solving. So I'll take a minute on some best practices, and then we'll see if there are any questions. It's important, again, overall, to identify and regularly communicate shared goals and common ground to your members of your cross-functional team or your matrix partners. These things may shift and change, but this is the basis of cooperation. Without a shared goal, it's very difficult for it to be desirable. Even if they like you and they want to focus on your team's effort, it will be difficult for them to give it time and attention. Establish goals and priorities for the matrix team before the individual groups. Once the individual groups are locked in, it becomes really challenging to get people focused on the matrix team goals or the cross-functional team goals. Build trust, and you build trust by increasing the perception of your credibility and the perception of your reliability. It also helps to demonstrate empathy and understanding of the other person's situation, even if you don't agree with it, just that you really get it, and to demonstrate a lower self-orientation. Now, if you do have shared goals in place, it's much easier to focus on others' needs and goals rather than your own. But a high self-orientation can be a real trust killer. If people believe you're most interested in your objectives and your needs over their objectives and needs, it can really diminish the perception of your trustworthiness. We talked about agreeing on roles and decision authority for key decisions well in advance. What you're doing here is you are defining what cooperation and collaboration looks like. What do we mean by it? And when do you need to collaborate and cooperate? The key here is to align your performance management system. You need to have some metrics that reinforce and focus on the cross-functional team objective, the matrix team objective. If all the metrics, performance metrics, and all the behaviors are driven by the silo, by the function, by the product, by the region, then people's focus and behavior will be drawn there. If you want people to focus on the cross-functional team and to cooperate and to collaborate, they need to have a hard performance metric that where there's something at stake that will get them to focus on the needs of their cross-functional team. It's also important to recognize that cooperation is a very fragile state. We are quicker to start competing than we are to start cooperating, and we are quicker to stop cooperating than we are to stop competing. And the baseline foundational elements of goals and roles and communication help sustain cooperation, and the skill of influencing helps you also sustain cooperation when faced with conflicting views and needs. All right, well, everyone, thank you very much. I hope to see you all at our next